I think their role was many and varied. I think we've all learned a lot of valuable lessons from what happened in the crisis. I think not the least of which was the overall use of leverage in the system and the interconnectedness between the markets that leverage really impacted. So individual banks may not have felt over-levered, but when you add it all up in the system, I think it was pretty over-levered. As a result, I think the size and shape of these banks has to change. I think you'll hear a lot more about what does too big to fail mean, and what do we do to make sure that no companies are necessarily that big that we need to worry about big companies being too big to fail. I think you're also going to see a lot of changes in the regulatory landscape, because I think that people realize that the markets are interconnected. So you're not going to have a global regulator, and the markets therefore are going to have to be connected. The regulations are going to have to be connected, and the bank's business that they do in each of these markets is also going to have to be much more closely looked after. I think it's hard to know. We have a history, not just in the United States, but in the world, of solving the problem that just happened rather than the problem that's around the next corner. So I think it's easy to say more regulatory oversight would have worked. It does appear that a lot of the markets were allowed to get quite large, and yet many of those markets were not regulated. So one might ask, well, it wouldn't necessarily have been more regulation. It would have been smarter regulation or smarter application of existing regulations, just covering more products. So my guess is that's what we'll see more than a whole ream of over-regulation going forward. You're going to strike hopefully the right balance, because we don't have time for just the comprehensive review approach. That's certainly a more idealistic view. I think those of us who have been in the markets for a while would say a comprehensive approach that's coordinated is where we all want to get to. The question is, how long does that take? History tells us that that's going to take a while, and if that takes 2 or 3 years, my point would be, are there some quick wins we can get that we know are directionally correct, and then we'll work out the details later. To answer the second part of that question first, I think that it's going to be very interesting to watch whether the American leadership in global finance can be maintained. Whether finger pointing is appropriate or a good use of anyone's time, I'll leave that to the historians. Certainly people feel that this was largely an Anglo-Saxon problem that spread to the rest of the world. I think that's convenient, but I don't think that's accurate either. I think all the banks in a lot of the world's biggest markets were involved. And the stage at which they were involved, to me, is kind of irrelevant. And I think what we've seen that's a very positive outcome the last few months here is that people have gotten away from trying to play the blame game, and people have spent more time trying to focus on how do we work our way out of this, and how do we work together to figure out we're all in it together, who cares how we got here. I think a general raising of the standards is the first thing. What you've seen coming out of the G20 is this concept that let's limit the opportunities for regulatory arbitrage between the world's leading economies and leading markets. So I think that's going to be the first step that people take. I think the second step we're going to see taken is more coordination among the regulators, and more coordination and cooperation from the institutions in these various jurisdictions. This idea that if I'm regulator A and you're regulator B, we're not going to exchange information anymore because it's specific to our jurisdiction, I think that's yesterday's news. I think there will be a lot of pressure on regulators to coordinate, to share information, and to recognize that if the markets are connected, the only way we're going to get there is by each regulator in its own country doing a great job in coordination with all the other regulators.